honored that we have in here Jesse Hofer from Silverwinds Hutterite community in Manitoba. And Jesse Hofer is an educator, translator, and historian. So he talks about Hutterite relation with Indigenous people in Manitoba. And I'm very curious how the two minorities once met and what happened to them. So please, this is your stage. Thank you very much, Leslie.
Thank you. It's good to be here. It has been good to be here to meet all of you and to talk about our common interest here. I want to note at the outset that I'm not from a community that's close to an Indigenous community, but I am 45 minutes from Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. And what struck me as I was preparing this paper is that all three of those names are Indigenous. Winnipeg is Cree for dirty waters. Manitoba is Cree for the narrows of the Great Spirit. And Kanata is Huron-Iroquois for village. To add to that, in Winnipeg, there are two rivers that meet at the forks, the Assiniboine River and the Red River. And Assiniboine is another Indigenous term. So all over Manitoba, you see references to Indigenous peoples. Just another word about the word Indigenous that I'll be using a fair bit. When I speak of Indigenous, that includes First Nations people, Métis, and Inuit. So that's three different groups under that umbrella. I will also use the term First Nations. I'll use the term Aboriginal. Sometimes I'll use the term Indian because it's still used legally and colloquially sometimes. In 1873, Canada's Minister of Agriculture, John Lowe, wrote a letter, popularly known as the Privilegium, to the Mennonites in South Russia, which granted them broad religious freedoms and large tracts of land for settlement in southeastern Manitoba. Just 2 years earlier, the government had entered into a series of numbered treaties. Can I click this? How does this work? Oh, look at this. So the government had entered into a series of numbered treaties with Indigenous peoples to coexist on the land in a covenant or partnership of mutual trust and benefit for, quote, as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the rivers flow. Without the signing of these treaties, the granting of land to immigrants under favorable conditions would not have been possible, or would have been significantly more complicated. Like other settlers, Canadian Hutterites benefited from the land made available through these numbered treaties negotiated by the Government of Canada with various First Nations groups. When the first Hutterite community was established in Manitoba, near Dominion City, in 1898, in anticipation of the Spanish-American War, Hutterites were able to secure similar rights as those granted to the Mennonites in 1873. The lands they bought to establish the original 6 communities in the rural municipality of Cartier in 1918 were located on Treaty 1 territory, so the blue region, a southern part of that. Although they paid significantly higher prices than the first wave of immigrants in the 1870s, the fact that it was available for settlement at all was due to the negotiation of the treaties half a century earlier. During the summer of 2020, I was involved in an online group that read a collection of documents written by Canadian Mennonites over roughly the last 50 years on issues related to Indigenous justice and land claims in Canada. At the same time, I was busy editing what will become For God's Truth, a Hutterite History Reader, published just last year. This provoked a question for me. How have Hutterites related to Aboriginal peoples in the 100 years or so that we've been in Manitoba? I was not surprised to learn that there is virtually no documentary or textual evidence of this relationship, but I was aware that some communities, like New Rosedale and its daughter colony Fairholme, had formed rich relationships with their local reserve, Long Plain First Nation, Ojibwe peoples. So I reached out to my former high school teacher and storyteller, Dora Maendel, who lives in Fairholme and grew up in New Rosedale, to see whether she would be willing to write an account of this relationship. Dora agreed, and her writing documents the early relations between Hutterites and Métis people in the Saint-Eustache area, as well as more recent relations with the local Ojibwe people at Long Plains. Learning about this history made me wonder what other stories I could find. My research is in its preliminary stages, but I have already uncovered a web of intriguing connections. Before I share some highlights of what I have uncovered and learned, I'd like to share a little bit more about the context that we find ourselves in Manitoba, in Canada. So a little bit about the Canadian context and then about the Manitoba context. So those circles that you see there and the white dots represent communities, Hutterite communities that are close to First Nations communities. There aren't a whole lot, it's a minority of them. I'll say more about that. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada was established in 2008 to document the history and legacy of Canada's residential school system and its impact on Indigenous peoples. Its purpose was to uncover a neglected aspect of Canada's history and guide the nation toward reconciliation. Over a period of about 150 years, some 150,000 Indian students were taken from their homes and communities and placed in these schools where they suffered abuse in many different forms, not least the tragic injustice of cultural erasure and assimilation. In 2021, based on one of the 94 calls to action made by the Commission, the Government of Canada designated September 30th as the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Other calls to action highlight the role of schools in teaching about this dark chapter of Canadian history. It was thus satisfying to be able to share Dora's account, which is now also in the reader, with Hutterite teachers and students on the inaugural day of that September 30. So a little bit on the Manitoba context now. Manitoba has the highest proportion of Indigenous people in its population compared to other provinces. Of Manitoba's 1.5 million residents, about 238,000 or 18% are Indigenous, so close to a fifth. Of those, about 58% live on 376 reserves across the province. They are the fastest growing ethnic group in Manitoba and have the youngest median age of any ethnic group in the province, 30.4 years of age compared to 41.3 for non-Indigenous members. It's 11-year gap, or 11-year difference. In comparison, there are about 12,000 Hutterites living in about 120 colonies, comprising less than 1% of Manitoba's population. To my knowledge, there are about 9 colonies in Manitoba that live within 20 kilometers of a reserve. So not all that many. And there's 5 that live within 10 kilometers. And I've identified the 5 in the large circle, but all the white dots you see are the 9 closest ones in Manitoba, most of them in southern Manitoba. The effects of trauma inflicted by the residential schools and other factors is felt in a number of ways. Indigenous peoples are overrepresented in Manitoba's prisons, homeless shelters, child welfare system, missing and murdered women and girls. Suicide rates are 4.5 times higher among the Indigenous population in Manitoba. Until very recently, 2021, First Nations students received only 50% of the funding, half the funding, that non-Indigenous students received, leading to poorer outcomes and lower graduation rates. If the treaty relationship that made it possible for Hutterites to settle in Manitoba is about being good neighbors and about mutual flourishing, then Hutterites, like other settlers, have an ongoing obligation to attend to this work. Further, if Hutterites are committed to a theology of peace and justice and reconciliation, in obedience to the way and spirit of Jesus, and if they wish to stand in continuity with their radical 16th century beginnings, which also involved deep concern for injustices in the poor and the marginalized, then this work should be seen as central to our life and mission. There are also reasons to be hopeful. On October 18, 2023, Manitobans elected Wap Kinew as the new Democratic Party, as the first First Nations Premier in Canadian history. One of the most controversial issues in the election campaign was a decision by the Progressive Conservative Party to not search a city landfill for the remains of 3 Indigenous women. This was seen as a turning point in the campaign and was part of the reason why Wapkanu won. Next, I'd like to give you a taste of some of the stories I've been able to uncover so far. So the first vignette, or short account, I want to share draws from the account written by Dora Maendel specifically for the Hutterite History Reader. Dora documents the relations between the New Rosedale community, one of the original 6 settlements in Manitoba in 1918, and the Métis people around Saint Eustache, located about 52 kilometers west of Winnipeg. The Métis are the offspring of European men, both French and English, and Ojibwe or Cree women. When Manitoba entered Confederation in 1871, the Métis faced significant challenges, including the loss of their ancestral hunting lands to incoming settlers, overt disrespect and racism from both settlers and the heavy-handed governors at Red River, and the collapse of the buffalo hunt in the mid-1870s. Many migrated further west in search of a better future, and those who remained struggled to eke out an existence as farmers, freighters, and laborers. For the Hutterites, the settlement years in Manitoba were made difficult by a significant debt load, an unfamiliar land, and the onset of the Great Depression only 12 years later. The senior pastor at Rosedale, Joseph Maendel, was very friendly toward local Métis families, welcoming them both into his own home and at the communal dining table. The Hutterites at Rosedale and the local Métis worked side by side, cutting wood and hay and clearing land. During the Great Depression, unemployment and hunger were widespread, and the Métis of Saint Eustache were especially hard hit. Joseph Maendel organized a road building project with the municipality that used gravel from Rosedale's gravel pit and employed a number of Métis men, some of whom continued working for the Highways Department many years later. The late Ben Maendel from the Baker community remembers his uncle's rationale for modeling and encouraging interaction with the Métis of Saint Eustache. C'est un suivi mio, he reasoned. They too are different from mainstream society like us. And so it's fitting that we work together and help each other out. There were other ways the two groups identified and benefited from each other. The Métis children who entered Saint Eustache schools speaking only French learned English partly through Hutterite contact. And the Rosedale Puem played hockey, that's young men, played hockey on the McKay rink nearby at a time that it was verboten, but never mind. At Christmas, the McKay family bought gifts, toys, fruit, and candies from Rosedale. Dora also documents more recent interactions with the Ojibwe people of Long Plains First Nations. She writes, one Long Plain woman became fondly known as the Longclaws Ankela, her grandmother, Longclaw's grandmother. I think Longclaws is her surname, because she came to Fairholme so regularly, typically with several grandchildren in tow. Bright-eyed and gracious, she wore a babushka-style kerchief and always a skirt. Sometimes it was even a shortened Hutterite skirt. When I die, she told the Fairholme women, I want to wear a Hutterite outfit. And would you come and sing at my wake and funeral? They promised and kept their word. The next 2 vignettes or short accounts I want to share are going to be very brief, and they are just a first word on research that's in progress. So the second account I want to share features a daughter community of Fairholme, Windy Bay, established in 1979, and the nearby Valley View colony, established in 1986, with the Swan Lake Reservation in southern Manitoba. I have a pointer here. Oops, I didn't want to do that. How about this? So this is Long Plain here. Fairholme is down here. And over here is Swan Lake with Windy Bay and Valley View. So I've been talking about this so far, and now I'm shifting to talk about Swan Lake. So Swan Lake is a reservation in south central Manitoba, and it's one of the few reserves that are located on agriculturally rich lands. The reserve was settled in 1873 by Chief Yellowquill after his people were starved out of their home territory along the Assiniboine River near Rathwell. Elder Dave Scott notes, "We have always had a good relationship with the Hutterites. For example, an Indigenous construction crew led by Ron Meaches built the kitchen at Windy Bay." So Indigenous construction crew was working at Windy Bay. Elder Scott remembers racism being a significant issue in the area, both against his own community and against the Hutterites. When Windy Bay first came, he remembers, the local farmers were saying, "Oh, they're going to clear all the bushes and they're going to poison the lakes." Chief Roy McKinney ignored these voices and forged a good relationship with their new Hutterite neighbors. When asked why the Hutterites were able to establish positive relations with his people, Elder Scott said, "I think we had a similar experience of racism with the white people." In 1975, the Manitoba Indian Agricultural Program was established to encourage Indigenous farming by providing access to resources, credit, and education. Elder Scott recalls how several young men from Swan Lake spent weeks during the summer for about 5 years learning agricultural skills from members of the Windy Bay community, including tractor and equipment maintenance and crop management. However, due to the high interest rates and high equipment costs, it was difficult for Indigenous farmers to get established and be profitable. Nevertheless, some were successful farmers until very recently, and several of the men were later able to get work with local farmers. Later, in 1996, when Swan Lake wanted to buy land in the area to settle land claims, nobody wanted to sell them land because, in Elder Scott's words, they didn't want an Indian as a neighbor. Valley View Colony, which had settled there in 1986, 10 years earlier, was an exception. They agreed to sell Swan Lake a quarter section of land in exchange for a 10-year lease. And I believe they leased this land to this day from the Swan Lake. According to Elder Scott, this sale would not have been possible without the existing trust between the two parties. Swan Lake recently received a government grant to develop a permaculture garden to promote food security through gardening knowledge, combining traditional gardening methods with Western approaches. Again, Elder Scott hopes to learn more about gardening from the local Hutterites. And he says, "I know how successful the Hutterites are in terms of their gardening practices. So we want to see if they could come out and support us and teach us whatever they know about gardening." This past May, in fact, this past spring, sorry, this is the closer view here. Elder Scott came to my classroom to talk to my students about a number of different things, history and wildlife and nature. And this past May, I took my grade 8-9 students to visit Swan Lake and learn from Elder Scott about Ojibwe history, wildlife, resource management, and these things. And this summer, in fact, as I speak, as of a few days ago, my cousin Caleb Hofer is doing a practicum for his university studies with Dave Scott. This is Dave Scott here at Swan Lake. He's learning about how industrial agriculture impacts water quality and biodiversity in the area. And I think this is just a beautiful picture of mutual friendship and learning that I hope we can build on. This is also Elder Scott. My third and final vignette I want to share involves the Hutterian Emergency Aquatic Response Team and their work, or HART is the acronym. Since 2017, the dive team based out of the Oak Bluff community near Morris has been involved in recovery missions at over 20 different First Nations communities, including 14 in Manitoba alone. Can I slide there, please? They have spent a total of over 90 days in Indigenous communities searching for drowning victims, often in very challenging conditions. So here you can see, these are all their missions to date in Canada. And again, most of them being in Manitoba, and most of those being among First Nations. Indigenous people in Canada have a deep sense that the government is often not there for them when they need help. They often feel abandoned by the government. And this has made HART's work especially impactful for them. HART is a nonprofit charitable organization that relies on sponsorships and donations and does not charge for their services. Paul and Manuel Maendel are both members of the HART team. They both speak appreciatively about the friendships they have made with Indigenous community leaders. Manuel says that he regularly receives calls from his Indigenous contacts seeking advice about challenges not related to HART's mission, such as fighting wildfires, and he enjoys those interactions. HART has limited resources and can't deploy to all calls across Western Canada's vast geographic distances. Manuel Maendel has founded a consulting business called Hydrobotic Solutions Incorporated, which provides training in the use of underwater search equipment. And he is working with First Nations leaders to coordinate training of Indigenous teams that could respond to recovery missions in their own communities. A team he trained in the Prince Albert area of Saskatchewan is already in operation, but training a team in Manitoba remains a work in progress. More research is needed to better understand the impact of HART's work in Indigenous communities, but one thing I think is clear: they are making a difference through acts of service in places where the need is urgent and where trust toward outsiders is rather fragile. So in conclusion, the land was not empty when Hutterites came to North America in 1874 and to Manitoba in 1918, and neither is it empty of stories that can teach us what it means to live peacefully with our Indigenous neighbors, with all our neighbors today. My long-term goal is to collect or to gather and publish a collection of these stories in the hope that they will remind us that any lasting reconciliation will be built on trust, respect, a relationship, and on good stories. And just maybe finally, there's two interesting themes that have emerged in my research so far, and they're the fact that both Hutterites and Indigenous peoples have both a similar history in terms of being marginalized, oppressed minorities that have tried to resist being acculturated into the mainstream. There's other parallels, but that's one of them. And the other thing I kept running into is that older generations, older members of our communities and their communities have had strong relationships, and that there's this need to educate and share these stories with young people, so it doesn't get forgotten, so it's passed on. So that encourages and motivates me to keep searching and keep writing on this. So I'll stop there. This is a photo of Paul and Manuel of the HART team with two of their Indigenous contacts friends.
Thank you very much.